I never should have gone out there alone. I was 32 at the time, and I'd been working as a freelance photographer for a few years. My job took me all over the country, mostly small towns and remote places where I could capture landscapes untouched by modern life. I loved being alone, away from the noise of the city, but I think that love of solitude is what nearly got me killed. This happened in the fall of 2018. I'd planned a week-long trip to a remote part of Montana, miles away from the nearest town. I'd rented a small off-grid cabin, nothing fancy, just a wooden structure with a single room, a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchenette. No electricity, no cell service. The owner was some old guy I met online through a wilderness rental site. He gave me the GPS coordinates and told me there was a hand-drawn map inside the cabin in case I wanted to explore the trails nearby. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed my truck with enough supplies to last the week: food, water, my camera gear, and a rifle just in case. The drive took almost a full day, most of it on winding dirt roads that felt like they hadn't been driven on in years. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that meant winter wasn't far off. The place was even more isolated than I expected. Thick trees surrounded the cabin on all sides, and a narrow trail led off into the woods. The nearest neighbor, if there even was one, was miles away. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. That first evening was quiet. I made a simple dinner on the propane stove, unpacked my gear, and stepped outside to take a few shots of the landscape as the sun set behind the mountains. The silence was almost unsettling. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. After a while, I headed inside, locked the door, and got the wood stove going. The heat filled the cabin quickly, making it feel cozy despite the creeping cold outside. I read for a bit, then fell asleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, flickering light around the room. It was silent, too silent. Even in the wilderness, you expect to hear something. Wind, distant animal sounds, the creaking of trees. But it was dead quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the dirt outside the cabin. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I was miles away from civilization. No one should have been out here. My truck was parked right in front of the cabin. Whoever was out there knew someone was inside. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and heavy, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting. After what felt like forever, the footsteps faded away into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Nothing. By morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I checked outside, but there were no tracks. Nothing. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. The next day, I went out hiking with my camera. I followed one of the trails marked on the hand-drawn map, winding through the dense forest. The air was crisp, and the forest was beautiful, but I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. A few hours later, I headed back to the cabin, feeling uneasy. That night, I made sure to lock the door and keep my rifle close. I didn't sleep much. I woke up early, still feeling that nagging sense of unease. I decided to set up some makeshift tripwires around the cabin. Nothing fancy, just some fishing line tied to empty cans. If something moved around the cabin that night, I'd hear it. As the sun started to set, I built a fire outside. It wasn't for warmth, it was for light. I wanted to see what was out there. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of metal rattling. The tripwires. Something was moving just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire cast long shadows, making it hard to see beyond the trees. Then I saw him, a man. He was standing just at the edge of the light, half hidden by the trees. He was tall, wearing dirty clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching. I raised my rifle, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. Then, slowly, he backed into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting to see if he'd come back. But he didn't. I packed my things at first light. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I noticed something on the cabin's front porch. A single boot print, larger than mine. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I got back to town, I told the local sheriff. He listened, nodded, and then told me something that made my blood run cold. A few years back, a man had gone missing in those woods. A hunter. His body was never found, just his campsite, torn apart like he'd left in a hurry. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I know this. I wasn't supposed to be out there, and neither was he. I never told anyone about what happened to me that winter, not in full detail. I tried once, but people either laughed it off or got too uncomfortable to let me finish. I don't blame them. Even I don't like thinking about it. It happened in 1997, up in the mountains of Colorado. I was 28, working odd jobs in construction, and between projects, I'd take solo trips out into the wilderness to clear my head. I wasn't some survivalist or anything, but I liked the quiet, the way the cold air kept people away. I had an old Chevy Blazer, a thick sleeping bag, and a hunting rifle I barely knew how to use. That was enough for me. That winter, I decided to spend a week up in the San Juan Mountains, away from everything. I had a plan: drive up as far as I could, hike in a few miles, set up camp, and just exist in the silence. I didn't want to deal with anyone. I had food, water, and extra gas in the back of my truck. The first 3 days went as planned. I parked my Blazer on a logging road that wasn't completely buried in snow, loaded up my pack, and hiked in about 5 miles. The air was dry, cold enough to make my lungs ache when I breathed too deep. I found a spot near a frozen creek, pitched my tent, and spent my time hiking and just enjoying the quiet. At night, the wind howled through the trees, but I was used to that. On the 4th day, things changed. I woke up to the sound of something moving in the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. The fire had burned out, leaving everything dark except for the moonlight on the snow. I listened, trying to convince myself it was a deer or an elk, but something felt off. The sound wasn't rhythmic like an animal walking. It was uneven, dragging, like something was limping. Then it stopped, dead silent. I waited for it to move again, but it didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and fell back asleep. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow. They were strange, long, deep impressions, almost human, but the stride was too wide, and some of them dragged like whoever left them had been pulling something heavy. They circled my campsite once, then wandered off into the trees. I tried not to think about it too much. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. I packed my stuff and decided to head back to my truck early. The silence was different now. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. I hiked fast, ignoring the way my stomach twisted every time I thought about those tracks. I made it back to the Blazer by mid-afternoon, relieved to see it exactly how I left it. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and cranked the heat. I was about to start the engine when I noticed something further up the road, a cabin. I hadn't seen it when I drove in, probably because the trees hid it well. It was an old, one-room structure, the kind loggers or trappers used decades ago. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but something about it bothered me. The door was wide open. I don't know why I got out. I should have just left, but I did. I grabbed my rifle, not that I thought I'd need it, and walked up to the cabin. The snow around the entrance was disturbed, like something had been dragged inside. My stomach tightened, but I kept going. Inside, it was dark, smelled like rot. My eyes adjusted, and that's when I saw it. A body, or at least something that had been a body. It was human-shaped, but wrong. The skin was stretched, grayish, barely clinging to the bones underneath. The arms were too long, the fingers thin and sharp. The mouth was open, lips pulled back too far, like it had been screaming. I should have left. I should have run. But I just stood there, my breath coming in short gasps. The thing on the floor wasn't fresh, but it wasn't frozen either. It looked dried out like it had been there for months. Then I saw something worse. There were more footprints in the snow. They led up to the body, but they also led away. Someone or something had been here after it had died. I backed up, rifle shaking in my hands. I needed to leave. I turned, stepping onto the porch, and that's when I heard it. Something moved in the woods, just beyond the tree line. Slow, dragging footsteps. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was watching me. I ran. I jumped into the Blazer, slammed the door, and turned the key so hard I thought it would snap. The engine groaned, then roared to life. Headlights cut through the trees, but I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning in the snow, then whipped around and sped down the road. I didn't stop. Not when I hit the highway, not when I reached town. I drove straight to a motel and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep. The next day, I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? I found a dead body, but I was too scared to check if it was real, that I heard footsteps in the woods. I left town instead, drove home and tried to forget. But I can't, because sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I remember those footprints, and I wonder if whatever was out there that night ever followed me home. I took the security contract because it was easy money. At least that's what I thought. A 2-week job watching over a remote property in the Montana wilderness. Some wealthy guy from California had bought a massive chunk of land, built a high-tech cabin, and wanted someone with a security background to keep an eye on it while he finalized some legal issues. I was a security specialist, trained in risk assessment and surveillance. I had done corporate security, private bodyguard work, and even some government contracts overseas. This job felt like a vacation. A fully stocked cabin, satellite internet, and nothing but trees for miles. No people, no threats, no problems. I arrived in early October. The drive up was long, the dirt road winding through dense pine forest, climbing higher into the mountains. No cell service, no neighbors, just a well-built, modern cabin with steel-reinforced doors, motion sensor lights, and cameras covering every angle. I parked, unloaded my gear, and did a full check of the place. The guy who owned it had spared no expense. State-of-the-art security system, bulletproof windows, and a gun safe loaded with rifles and handguns. It was clear he wasn't just some rich guy who wanted to play off-grid. He was preparing for something. The job was simple. Watch the cameras, patrol the property, and report any suspicious activity. There wasn't supposed to be any. The nearest town was over an hour away, and the only way in or out was that long dirt road. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my time checking the cameras, making rounds outside, and sitting by the wood stove reading. The wind howled through the trees at night, but that was normal this high up. Then small things started to feel off. The motion sensors on the east side of the cabin triggered a few times, but nothing showed up on the cameras. Probably animals, I told myself. Deer, maybe a bear. I checked the perimeter and found nothing. No prints, no signs of movement. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A sharp, deliberate tap 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 on one of the windows. I grabbed my flashlight and gun, heart pounding. I moved carefully, checking each window, but saw nothing. The cameras hadn't picked up anything either. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a tree branch, maybe the wind. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was on the opposite side of the cabin. The same tap tap tap. I checked the cameras first, nothing. I checked outside, nothing. But this time, I saw something strange. In the dirt near the back of the cabin, there were footprints. Bare human footprints. They led from the tree line to the cabin and then disappeared. Who the hell was walking around barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle in hand, watching the monitors. Nothing. By the sixth night, I felt watched. It's a hard thing to describe, but if you've ever been in combat or high-risk situations, you know the feeling. That pressure in your gut, the sense that something is just out of sight. The motion sensors kept triggering, but never when I was outside. Only when I was inside watching the monitors. I did another full sweep of the property, this time going deeper into the woods. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found something that made my skin crawl. Pile of dead birds. Small ones. Sparrows, finches. All neatly stacked on top of each other. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just a pile like someone had placed them there on purpose. I went back to the cabin, locked everything down, and waited. That night, I heard the sound again. But this time, it wasn't tapping. It was breathing, right outside my window. Long, slow breaths. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just listened. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I checked the cameras. Nothing. I checked outside. Nothing. The footprints were back, though. This time, there were more of them. On the eighth night, I set traps. I wasn't playing games anymore. I put up tripwires, set up a makeshift alarm system with empty cans, and even placed a few hunting traps near the treeline. If someone was messing with me, I was going to catch them. At around 2 a.m., one of the alarms went off. A loud clatter of cans falling. I grabbed my rifle and stormed outside, flashlight sweeping the area. There was something crouching near the trees. Not standing. Crouching. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its arms were too long, its body too thin. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, it moved. Not ran. Moved. 1 second it was crouched near the trees, the next it was gone. Like it had melted into the darkness. I fired anyway. 3 shots. The gunfire echoed through the forest, but there was no sound of impact. No cry of pain. Just silence. I backed into the cabin, locking the door, checking the cameras. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. By the 12th night, I was done. I had sent multiple reports to the owner, but he hadn't responded. I had called the local authorities, but they wouldn't send anyone out unless there was an actual crime. I decided to leave at first light, but I never got the chance. At around 3 a.m., every motion sensor around the cabin went off. Every single one. The cameras glitched. The feed cut in and out, showing nothing but static. Then the power went out. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. A noise came from the roof. Something was up there. I aimed my flashlight at the ceiling, listening. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved above me. Then the hatch to the attic creaked. I pointed my rifle at it, my finger on the trigger. The hatch swung open. I never saw what came down. I fired, over and over. The muzzle flash lit up the room, but I saw nothing. Pain exploded in my side, then my back. Something fast, something strong. I felt myself getting dragged. The last thing I remember was the cold air on my face as I was pulled out into the night. They found my truck a week later, still parked outside the cabin. The cabin itself was empty. No blood, no bullet holes, no signs of struggle. Just a single small pile of dead birds near the back door. I never thought I would end up here, alone, deep in the French countryside, building a cabin from scratch. It wasn't some grand adventure or a romanticized escape from city life. It was necessity. Life in Paris had become too expensive, too crowded, too suffocating. I wanted space, something that belonged to me, something simple. I had saved up just enough money to buy a small plot of land in the rural south of France, near the edge of a dense forest. It was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but I didn't ask too many questions. I just wanted out of the city. I arrived in early spring, when the land was still damp from the long winter rains. The plot was isolated, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest village, a small town called Valmont. The town had a single grocery store, a bakery, and a bar where the locals gathered. People kept to themselves, but they weren't unkind. A few older men at the bar warned me that the land I had bought wasn't ideal for building. Something about the soil, the way the land shifted after the rains. But I had already bought it. I didn't care. I brought all the supplies I thought I would need: tools, lumber, insulation. I planned to build something small, just a one-room cabin with a loft for sleeping. It wouldn't be luxurious, but it would be mine. I was determined to do it alone. The first few weeks were exhausting but satisfying. I cleared the land, cut down a few trees, and started digging the foundation. The soil was softer than I expected, almost loose, and the deeper I dug, the stranger it got. There were layers of dark, damp earth mixed with patches of pale, almost grayish clay. I found old bones buried deep in the ground. Not human, at least I didn't think so. Probably animal remains, long forgotten. I ignored them and kept working. Nights were the hardest. There was no electricity yet, so I used a small camping lantern. The darkness out here was absolute, pressing in from all sides. The forest was full of sounds: branches snapping, distant rustling, the occasional cry of an animal. I told myself it was just wildlife. Then I started noticing strange things. My tools weren't where I had left them. My measuring tape was missing for days and then showed up inside my tent, though I swore I hadn't put it there. I woke up one morning to find footprints near my worksite, barefoot, human. They led from the trees to the unfinished foundation and then disappeared. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe an animal had left some odd marks in the mud. But I started locking my tools inside the car at night, just in case. By the third month, the walls were up, and I had started working on the roof. The isolation was getting to me. I hadn't seen another person in weeks. The people in Valmont barely acknowledged me when I came into town for supplies. They answered my questions, but only briefly, as if they didn't want to encourage conversation. I figured they just didn't trust outsiders. Then the land started changing. One morning, I stepped outside my tent and found deep cracks in the ground around the cabin's foundation. I hadn't noticed them the day before. The soil looked like it had shifted overnight, like something underground had pushed against it. The next day, I found something even worse. A hole had opened up in the ground, about 10 meters behind the cabin. It wasn't there before. It was about a meter wide, perfectly round, like a sinkhole. The edges were smooth, and the bottom was too dark to see. I dropped a rock inside. No sound, no impact, just darkness. Covered it up. I shoveled dirt back into the hole, packed it down, and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. I started sleeping inside the unfinished cabin. It wasn't fully enclosed yet, but it felt safer than the tent. One night, I woke up to a sound, something moving outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I stayed perfectly still. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing now and then. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Then silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I checked outside.
No footprints.
No signs of anything. I kept building. I had come too far to stop now. The roof was on, the walls were insulated, and I had started installing the door. I told myself I was just paranoid, that isolation was making me hear things, imagine things. Then I found another hole. This one was closer, right next to the cabin. Smaller, but just as deep. And this time there were marks around it. Not footprints. Drag marks, like something had been pulled into it. I stopped working. That night, I locked myself inside the cabin. No windows yet, just a solid wooden door with a makeshift lock. I sat there, gripping the hammer, staring at the door. Something was outside. I could hear it moving, dragging itself through the dirt. Slow, steady movements circling. Then it stopped, right outside the door. Silence. Then a knock. Not loud, just a soft, deliberate tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking continued.
Top. Top. Top.
Then the door handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. I had locked it. There was no way it could turn. But it did. And then it stopped. I didn't sleep. I sat there until the sun rose, until the knocking finally stopped, until the footsteps faded into the woods. At dawn, I packed my things. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I loaded everything I could into the car and drove straight to Valmont. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I checked into a cheap hotel, locked the door, and stayed inside for 2 days. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? That something had been watching me? That the land itself was wrong? On the third day, I drove back to the cabin. I had to see it one last time. When I got there, I saw the final sign that I had made the right choice. The cabin was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, just gone. The ground where it stood was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. No wood, no debris, no sign that I had spent months building anything. And in the center of where it had been, a hole, perfectly round, perfectly dark. I left that day and never came back. I don't know why I went in. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe boredom, or maybe something deeper I didn't want to admit to myself. Either way, that night changed everything. I had always liked exploring places people avoided, old barns, abandoned buildings, even underground tunnels once. But this was different. This wasn't just another forgotten place. It was something worse. It was late October when I first saw it. I was driving down an old back road outside of town, past endless fields and stretches of woods that hadn't been touched in years. I wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just killing time, looking for something interesting. That's when I saw the cemetery. It was small, maybe 50 or 60 graves, the kind of place families used a century ago before big cemeteries took over. The iron gate was still standing, rusted and leaning, and a stone arch at the entrance had a name worn down by time. I slowed the car and looked inside. The grass was overgrown, covering most of the tombstones, but in the back, past all the graves, I saw something else. A cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, just a dark shape against the night sky. It didn't look like it belonged there. Cemeteries don't have cabins. They have mausoleums, crypts, maybe a caretaker's shack, but this was none of those. It was something else. Something abandoned, left to rot with the graves. I should have kept driving. Instead, I pulled over. The air was cold when I stepped out of the car. Not freezing, but sharp enough to sting my nose. The smell of damp leaves and rotting wood filled the air. I climbed over the low stone wall, my boots sinking into the wet grass. The place felt wrong. Not haunted, just forgotten. the kind of place no one had cared about for a long time. As I walked through the graves, I read the names on the stones. Most were from the late 1800s, some even older. The writing was faded, but I could still make out a few names. Eleanor Finch, 1823 to 1891.
Yanıtın hale 1855-1882.
Infant daughter, 1893. Some had small statues next to them, weathered by time, their faces smooth and featureless. A few graves had sunken into the earth, caving in like no one had visited them in years. Then I noticed something strange. One of the graves near the back wasn't sunken at all. It looked fresh. The dirt was packed tightly, no grass growing over it yet. But that didn't make sense. No one had been buried here in over 100 years. I felt something in my gut tighten. I looked away. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, a trick of the light. I kept walking toward the cabin. Close, it was even worse than I thought. The wood was gray and splintered. The roof half collapsed on one side. The door was slightly open, swinging just a little in the breeze. I could see inside just darkness. I hesitated. Everything in me was telling me not to go in. But I did anyway. The inside was even colder than outside. The smell of damp wood and decay filled the air. The floor was covered in dead leaves and dirt, broken glass crunching under my boots. There was an old wooden table in the middle of the room, covered in dust and something that looked like dried mud. A few chairs lay broken nearby, and against the far wall, there was a stone fireplace. Then I saw the bed. It was in the corner, nothing but a rusty frame and a filthy mattress. The blankets were still on it, bunched up, like someone had been sleeping there. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. It was the smell. Something had rotted here. I didn't want to know what it was. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were smaller, lighter, like someone had walked through here recently. Someone else had been here, or still was. I should have left then, walked out, driven away, and never looked back. But something caught my eye. A metal ring in the floor. A trapdoor. It was half hidden under dirt and leaves. But now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My pulse was loud in my ears as I walked toward it. I reached down and pulled. The door creaked open. The smell hit me first. Thick, heavy, like damp earth and something else. Something I didn't want to name. The hole beneath was deep, leading down into complete darkness. A ladder was nailed to the side, disappearing into the black. I shined my flashlight down. The light barely reached the bottom, but I saw dirt walls, a packed earth floor, and something else. A wooden box. Not a coffin. Not quite. Just a wooden box about 5 feet long, nailed shut. My breath came fast. My chest felt tight. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, staring down at it. Then I heard it. A sound from inside the box. A thud. A slow, weak thud, like something was trying to get out. I don't remember running. I don't remember climbing back up or sprinting through the graves. I only remember the feeling, the overwhelming, gut-wrenching terror that clawed at my throat. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I had imagined it, that my mind had twisted shadows and sounds into something else. But a few weeks later, I made the mistake of looking it up. That cemetery? It had been abandoned for over 100 years. No one had been buried there in decades. But the last recorded burial? It was in an unmarked grave, and it was recent. I never planned on staying in the cabin alone. It wasn't even my idea. My brother and I had booked it together for a week of fishing, hiking, and just getting away from everything. It was an old rental, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, far from any town, with nothing but trees in every direction. No cell service, no neighbors, just a dirt road leading to a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was late October, right when the cold started creeping in, but before the heavy snow. The air was crisp, the leaves had mostly fallen, and the woods had that eerie, silent feeling that only comes when everything starts dying for the season. It was peaceful during the day, but at night it was a different story. 3 days into our trip, my brother got a call from his job when we drove out to the nearest town for supplies. Something urgent came up, and he had to leave the next morning. He asked if I wanted to go with him, but I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I figured I'd stay the rest of the week alone, do some hiking, and just enjoy the quiet. I had no idea how much I'd regret that choice. The first night alone was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, cooked some canned soup, and went to bed early. The only thing that woke me up was the wind, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak. I slept fine, though, and the next morning, I hiked down to the lake, fished for a bit, and enjoyed the quiet. Everything was fine until later that afternoon. I was chopping wood behind the cabin when I noticed something. It was small, almost nothing, but it bothered me. The pile of firewood we'd stacked near the back door looked different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I was sure something was off. It looked messy, like someone had kicked at it or moved a few logs around. It didn't make sense. No animals around here were big enough to mess with firewood like that. I brushed it off and finished chopping, but as I went inside, I had this nagging feeling, like I was being watched. I locked the door and checked the windows, but I didn't see anything. Still, that feeling stuck with me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside made me sit up and listen. The wind, the rustling leaves, even the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. It was probably just normal forest noises, but being alone out there made it all seem different. I finally dozed off around midnight, but woke up suddenly a couple of hours later. There was a noise outside. It was a dull, steady thump. I sat up, holding my breath. Came again. A slow, heavy thump. 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 It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the firewood pile. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window, my heart pounding. I had no idea what I was expecting to see, but when I shined the light outside, there was nothing, just the empty clearing and the trees beyond. I stood there for a while, listening, but the noise had stopped. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe some animal had knocked something over. I tried to shake it off and went back to bed, but sleep never really came. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, checking for anything out of place. The firewood looked even messier than before, like someone had been kicking it around. I also noticed something else, footprints. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were bare feet. They led from the woods to the firewood pile, then back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't mine. They weren't my brother's. And they were fresh. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been outside my cabin last night. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was some local messing around. Maybe some drifter passing through. Maybe they were already gone. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept the rifle close and made sure every door and window was locked. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The same slow, heavy thump, thump, thump outside the back door. I sat up in bed, gripping the rifle so hard my hands ached. Then, a new sound, something dragging across the porch. A long, slow scraping noise, like wood against wood. I didn't move. I just listened, heart pounding in my ears. Then silence. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When I finally got the courage to check outside, my stomach turned. The firewood pile had been completely knocked over, logs scattered everywhere, and the footprints were back. Leading from the woods, circling the cabin, stopping at the back door, then disappearing into the trees again. That was it. I packed my bag, grabbed the rifle, and threw everything into my truck. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror. There was someone standing at the tree line, far enough away that I couldn't see details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. Just standing there, barefoot. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. By the time I reached town, I felt like I could breathe again. I stopped at a gas station, got coffee, and tried to calm down. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, but something about it felt wrong. Before heading home, I told the guy at the gas station about it. He just nodded like he'd heard it before. "You were up at that old rental off the lake?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah," he said. "People don't stay there long." That was all he said. I never went back. I had always thought a cabin in the woods would be a peaceful retreat, a break from the noise of daily life, the perfect place to unwind and get some solitude. I was wrong. It was late October when I finally made the trip. The kind of crisp autumn weather where the leaves fall in heaps and the cold air wraps itself around you like a blanket. I was 28, recently divorced, and looking for somewhere to clear my head. A place where I wouldn't have to deal with anything for a few days. The cabin wasn't too far from where I grew up, about a 3-hour drive north of my small town in Pennsylvania. It belonged to an old family friend who had let me borrow it. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led to the cabin. The place looked exactly how I'd pictured it. Wooden exterior, overgrown with ivy, the windows dark, as if no one had been there for a while. It was a bit run down, but that was fine with me. I didn't need luxury. I needed quiet. I pulled up and parked the car, grabbed my things, and made my way to the porch. The door creaked as I opened it. The smell of dust and wood immediately hitting my nose felt still, like the air inside hadn't moved in years. There was a large fireplace in the center of the main room, with an old couch and a couple of mismatched chairs. The kind of rustic charm you see in those cozy cabins advertised in magazines. There was a small kitchen to the left and a staircase leading up to a loft where the bedroom was. A wood-burning stove sat by the back wall, and the only sound in the house was the occasional creak of the floorboards. I set my things down, and for a second, I just stood there, taking it all in. There was no one around for miles, just the woods. It was perfect. I made a fire, unpacked my food, and spent the night sitting by the warmth of the flames, reading and eating. It was peaceful, too peaceful. I didn't realize it at the time, but that stillness would be the last time I felt at ease. The first night passed without incident. I slept fitfully, occasionally waking to the sound of the wind whistling through the trees outside. The bed wasn't the most comfortable, but it was enough. When morning came, the air was colder than it had been the day before, and fog hung heavy in the trees outside. I decided to take a walk through the woods, just to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. I grabbed my jacket and boots and stepped outside. The fog clung to the ground, and it was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the damp ground. I walked for a few hours, taking in the scenery, the crisp smell of pine trees mixing with the earthiness of the fallen leaves. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. The woods were dense, the trees towering over me, their branches heavy with the weight of autumn. I had no real plan. I just wandered deeper and deeper into the woods, enjoying the solitude. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I kept walking, something started to feel off. The woods felt too quiet, too still, like everything was holding its breath, waiting for something. I paused, looking around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old, dense forest. Wildlife was everywhere, but the deeper I went, the more I started to feel like something was watching me. My heart started to race, and I began to pick up my pace, eager to return to the cabin. When I finally made it back, I was breathing heavily, and my hands were clammy. The fog had started to lift, and the air felt warmer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. But that night, I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. That night, the sounds started. It began with something tapping against the cabin walls. At first, it was so quiet I thought I had imagined it. But as it continued, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the walls from the outside. I got up to check, but when I opened the door, there was nothing, just the same empty woods. I went back to bed, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped, but I couldn't fall back asleep. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving just outside the window, but when I'd look, there was nothing. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I spent the rest of the night awake, eyes fixed on the door, listening for any noise that would confirm I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things, ready to drive back to the safety of town. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cabin was surrounded. Around the perimeter, a thick ring of what looked like freshly dug dirt circled the entire cabin. I felt my stomach drop. There were no tools nearby, no signs of anyone having been there. It was as if the earth itself had risen to form a barrier around the place. I tried to convince myself it was just some kind of natural phenomenon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone had done this. That night, the tapping returned. But this time, it was louder, closer, as if someone or something was standing just outside my window, tapping with fingers one by one. My heart hammered in my chest as I huddled under the covers, not daring to make a sound. I heard the faint rustling of footsteps, the crunch of leaves, and then a low, guttural growl. I froze, terrified, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The growl sounded too close, too real. I waited, listening to the sound of my own breathing, waiting for it to stop. The footsteps receded, and the tapping faded away, but I didn't sleep. I didn't even move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally left, I didn't look back. The woods were silent again, but I knew the things I heard weren't just my imagination. There was something out there, something that had been waiting for me to leave the safety of the cabin. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw something watching me from the tree lean, but I didn't stop to look. The cabin was behind me, but the feeling stayed with me. The woods, the tapping, the growl. I would never return. I don't know who or what was out there, but I learned the hard way that some places are best left undisturbed. The silence in the woods may be peaceful at first, but it hides something darker, something watching, waiting. And when it's ready, it will make itself known.